Hi, I'm Greg Corombos. My guest at this time is Inez Stepman, Senior Political Analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. She joined me earlier this month to preview the fight over the Equal Rights Amendment, as Democrats in Virginia claimed their ratification of the amendment would make Virginia the 38th and final state needed to add the ERA to the Constitution. And on Wednesday, the Virginia House of Delegates did just that by a vote of 59 to 41. But others, like Inez, are saying not so fast. First of all, the window to ratify the amendment closed 38 years ago. In addition, a number of states that initially approved the amendment have since rescinded those votes. But Inez is also sounding the alarm on the impact the ERA would have. And Inez, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's complicated until you actually look at what Congress established in terms of a window to ratify the amendment. But when folks see headlines like Virginia, 38th state needed to ratify Equal Rights Amendment, it seems like it's pretty cut and dried, but it's not. Congress can extend this window, apparently, but would that be the end of the deal or no?
So the House likely will vote to strip the deadline in the next week or so, perhaps 2 weeks, and that's a Democratic House, and then it will go to the Senate for a decision on whether or not to strip that deadline, which was 1982, right? So Congress passed this amendment and sent it to the states for ratification by the constitutionally required 2/3 back in the 70s, sent it back out to the states in 1972. Initially, they put a 7-year clock on ratification. When 35 states had ratified by the expiration of that clock, they extended the deadline to 1982. No additional states ratified because by that time, as many of your listeners probably know, Phyllis Schlafly and conservative women had mounted a opposition campaign to an amendment that looked like it was on the fast track to the Constitution. It was in the political party platforms of both the Republican and the Democratic Party at that time. And so there was a huge backlash against it. And not only did they fail to get to the 38 states, as you mentioned, actually 4 states rescinded their ratification, and a 5th state wrote into their original ratification of the amendment a deadline as well, so a sunset deadline. So there are real legal questions as to whether proponents can count all of those ratifications, even the ones that have been rescinded from almost 50 years ago, and then add to them the 3 modern ratifications, which have been Nevada, Illinois, and now Virginia.
Inez, in researching this topic for our previous conversation, I came across an interesting conclusion from a Supreme Court justice who said that, no, this window is closed. I support this amendment, but if we need to do it, the whole process needs to start over again with 2/3 of both houses of Congress and then 3/4 of the states. And that conclusion came from that noted friend of the patriarchy, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So if the Congress were to actually extend the deadline, would the courts still get involved? How does that work?
Well, there would certainly be a challenge, and you're absolutely right. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is one of the largest proponents of an equal rights amendment. She has been for decades. But yes, a couple months ago, she came out with a statement that said, no, sorry, this is an illegitimate process. And it's easy to see why, right? If you think about the basic purpose of Article 5, of the article that permits amendments to the Constitution, if you think about that 2/3 threshold in Congress, and then the 3/4 threshold in the state, those are intended to ensure that anything that we add to the highest law in our land has overwhelming support among the American people. And when you have this kind of illegitimate process where it's over decades and decades, and you don't respect the ability of states to change their mind over the course of those decades, you get something that's very contrary to the spirit of the amendment process. You get an amendment potentially ratified with a minority or even just a couple states that think it's a good idea. So definitely this is one of the battles that will be fought out in the courts. It will be one of many. So the rescission battle will be another that I mentioned. And then also there are arguments that the folks who wanted to change the deadlines, that they can't do that by majority vote, right? Because the original deadline was set by 2/3, that requirement for the amendment. So it's whether that deadline language can actually be severed from the text of the amendment and therefore modified by pure majority vote rather than needing 67 senators, for example, to modify that. So there will be a whole series of irregularities about this amendment that will go to the courts. But I also think that this amendment, it's worth talking about how this amendment would be really bad for women and girls in this country, and its consequences could be incredibly radical, way beyond, let's say, what some of the headlines have said with this ratification in Virginia. Oh, finally, men and women will be equal under the Constitution. Men and women already are equal under the U.S. Constitution and under U.S. federal law and in the law of all 50 states. Sex discrimination is forbidden by state, federal, and constitutional law. This amendment would actually force us and force the law not to recognize the very real biological differences between men and women in situations where they really matter. And in some cases, not recognizing the fact that men and women are different in very real ways could actually put women in harm's way.
Inez, I want to follow up on that in just a moment, but I also want to follow up on what you said about severability real quickly. You mentioned that there's a big question since the window to ratify was part of the two-thirds approved by the House and Senate back in the 70s, but there was also a congressional extension that extended that window to 1982. Do you know whether that extension vote required the two-thirds majority?
So that was done by majority vote. And so, for example, my former law professor, Sai Prakash at UVA Law, has argued that extension was also illegitimate. And there's a whole and interesting legal history. All the amendments, if you look during the progressive era, they all have deadlines attached to them. If you actually, bring out your copy of the Constitution and you start looking through, you'll see a lot of amendments that have that deadline language attached. And at a certain point, Congress stopped doing that just to sort of unclutter the Constitution. And so there's a really interesting historical debate about whether that decluttering amounts to an actual substantive part of the amendment that can't be changed by majority vote but requires two-thirds. So there are a whole host of legal issues here. It will take the court some time to sort these things out. Unfortunately, the precedent on some of these issues is very, very limited. So, for example, on the rescission issue, most of the precedent is from post-Civil War, right? A unique situation in American history where some states tried to de-ratify, for example, the 14th and 15th Amendments after the Civil War and after Reconstruction. Well, that's not exactly an analogous situation to this amendment process, but that precedent is out there nevertheless. So some of these are questions that our republic really hasn't confronted, but there does seem to be something wrong with a process that doesn't take, again, that overwhelming majority of the American people to say, yes, we want to add this to the highest law of the land.
Well, just like in the 1970s, if you look at the text of the amendment, it's pretty simple. It says equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. And that simplicity is what led to those 35 states ratifying it until Phyllis Schlafly got her movement going and stopped it in its tracks. You have recently responded on Twitter following the vote in Virginia today, pointing out things that would likely be unconstitutional under an equal rights amendment, including not drafting women into combat, government money to women's shelters, spousal Social Security, public university women's sports teams, separate women's prisons, boys and girls bathrooms in public schools here. So what are folks not considering when they see language that's wrapped up in a sentence or two here?
Right. So proponents are really selling this amendment as recognizing that basic legal equality that the overwhelming majority of the American people agree with, right? Men, women, every poll that's out there shows that men and women in this country do see basic legal equality as a good thing. They also already think we have it, right? And they're not wrong. Proponents kind of say, oh, the American people are so dumb, they don't know that they don't actually have basic equality. No, men and women do have basic equality in the United States. So, for example, nobody says that women don't have the right to free speech under the First Amendment or the right to worship under the First Amendment, right? We both, men and women, have the same due process rights under the Constitution. We both have the right to vote. Women were granted that by the 19th Amendment, done through a much more regular process than this amendment is going through. And then, as I said, federal law prohibits sex discrimination, and so does state law, and so does the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. But what the ERA would do is take away that narrow exception that currently exists under the 14th Amendment to say that states can, in some circumstances, recognize that the differences between men and women do matter. So, arbitrary discrimination saying, only women are hireable for a particular government job, or only men can be allowed to perform a particular government job. That, of course, is forbidden by the 14th Amendment. But what the 14th Amendment currently, under our interpretation, does not forbid is, in some narrow instances, state law or federal law taking into account the fact that men and women are different, right? We are biologically different. And so I gave in my tweet some of those examples where laws have been allowed to stand under the current constitutional interpretation because they recognize those differences. So, for example, common sense says you can't put female prisoners in with men in a general population of prisoners because the women are uniquely vulnerable in those kinds of situations because they are not as strong as men. Okay, that is a common sense thing, a common sense argument that would then become constitutionally infirm under an ERA. Similarly, something like Social Security spousal benefits, right? It used to be benefits for stay-at-home wives and mothers. That language was made gender neutral. But Ruth Bader Ginsburg, to return to her as a proponent for the ERA, she has suggested that even gender neutral language, if the overwhelming benefit is to allow the vast majority of people who stay home are women and not men still in 2020, she saw that those kinds of laws, those facially neutral laws like spousal Social Security, as essentially a subsidy to keep women out of the workforce. And she thought that that would actually violate what she called an equality principle that she thinks that the ERA would ratify, right? So this is really up for interpretation. It could be interpreted very, very narrowly by courts. It could be interpreted very, very broadly by courts to ban any kind of distinctions between men and women, including things like public school restrooms and locker rooms. Those are currently separated for the most part for boys and girls, right? We have all of the attendant controversy with the transgender exceptions to those rules. The ERA would just do away with any exceptions and say, forget it. You don't even have to claim to be a woman to go into a woman's bathroom. It's just illegal for a public school or any government entity to say this bathroom is for women and this bathroom is for men.
And as you pointed out on Twitter as well, Phyllis Schlafly and the drafters even of the amendment back in the 70s probably could not have envisioned the transgender debate that we're having now. And that's another dimension that certainly comes into play. But as you're suggesting here, it would almost be the Wild West. Whatever you want to do is pretty much open game here.
Yeah, and that applies to women's sports, right? This would be essentially the end of women's sports in public universities. So you wouldn't even have to claim to be a woman to then participate in the women's track team, for example, in UC Berkeley. You would just have an integrated track team, and whoever won. Well, common sense dictates we know that men are faster. And as a general rule, male runners are faster than female runners, which means all of these girls would miss out on scholarships. They would miss out on the opportunity to compete. And perversely, this amendment is being pushed as, some kind of advancement for equality for women and girls, when in fact integrating everything makes it so that something like women's sports couldn't really functionally exist.
So the inequality would actually affect women perhaps more than anybody else if this were to be approved. And as we've already kept you too long here, thanks very much for your time today. We'll probably check back in as this debate keeps going.
Thank you so much for having me.
Inez Stepman is a senior political analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.